Hungry Trilobyte Podcast would like to start by acknowledging these fine conventions. SoonerCon, Oklahoma's longest-running pop culture convention, is ready to return in 2023. SoonerCon 31 will be held in Norman, Oklahoma on June 30th through July 2nd, 2023. Gaming, cosplay, autographs, and an art auction await. Visit SoonerCon.com for more details. The Hellmouth Convention, where fandoms bleed together. Evoking the center of the mystical convergence, our event includes fandoms and travelers from all over the world. Like the Hellmouth itself, things gravitate toward it that you might not find elsewhere. The celebration is scheduled for June 9th through 11th, 2023 in Los Angeles, California. Go to thehellmouth.org to plan your visit. On mic today, we have Jim, the Podcast Sherpa. How you doing, good sir?
Hello there, Aaron. Good to see you.
Good seeing you, too. We got together a ways back. We were trying to figure out exactly when it was. I'm going to link to that episode in our show notes, but we had a good chat about just podcaster to podcaster, trying to figure out what we have in common, because our shows have a very similar bent that we just like creative people. We like that energy.
Absolutely.
Why did you get into it? How did you decide on your format for your show?
It's funny. The original idea for the show was I wanted to do a music podcast. And because I'm a really big music buff. But I saw when you kind of got started, there was a lot of licensing issues. And, you really have to tread very carefully when you're doing that sort of podcast. So I was like, well, what else can I do? And I was like, well, I'm enjoying listening to all these different types of podcasts. I'm like, why not do a podcast about podcasts? And I was off to the races from there.
Okay, so when did you get into podcasting? Like, when did you start listening?
When did I get listened? About, I would say, close to 5 years ago.
Okay.
I was late to the game.
Well, you maybe not. I mean, I was there a lot earlier than most, but I started as soon as I could have. So I don't think you were late. I think you were grabbing it when the culture grabbed it. So you were like right in the meaty part of the curve. That's the way I'd look at it.
Just as the wave was starting to hit the sand.
Yeah, exactly. And you got to see a lot of stuff with fresh eyes. So when you do what kind of thing you're doing, where you come up with an idea, like, what about a podcast about podcasting, about, just, you're starting to see this is actually going to be a force in the world. This is something that I want to grab onto. And I think that's pretty darn cool.
Yeah. I don't know if you did this when you started the Hungry Trilobite, but when I decided I wanted to do it, I had like a little Post-it and I kept it in my wallet. And every time I got like an idea, I would write it down on this little piece of paper. So then by the time I was like ready to record, I had about like 20 different ideas on like a Post-it, like yay big.
I don't do Post-it notes. I have a little notebook.
Okay.
A physical notebook, and it has no organization whatsoever. It's like literally it goes from the brain to the pen, and then I figure it out later.
And my handwriting is horrible. I'm like, why did I write cow on this piece of paper?
People are like, why did you not become a doctor?
That's right. When I was in junior high school, I had this wonderful science teacher named Mr. Levecki, and he said, I'm going to call you Doc for the rest of the year. He said, because you have a handwriting like a doctor.
Well, we figured out a way, something that worked for us. Nobody complains about a podcaster having bad handwriting.
That is true. That is very true.
So what do you see the culture of the podcasting world being like right now? As somebody who's done this as long as you have now, and I love your show. You've got good stuff. So you know what you're doing.
Well, I mean, podcasting encapsulates so much, though, I mean, there is something for everybody, depending on what your interests are. I remember talking to Dave Jackson a while ago, who runs the School of Podcasting. And he actually said to me, he said, if somebody asks you about a podcast, just say, well, just, Google your interest there. And in all likelihood, you will find a podcast about it. So, you can go into different directions once you start listening. That's why I call it Mount Podcastia, because it's just one big mountain of podcasts.
And what I like to tell people about why they should look into this is because it is a very empowering format. Mm-hmm. It doesn't cost a lot to get into it. You can reach almost anybody right away if they want to hear what you have to say. And that's kind of the tricky part, is to say something that somebody wants to hear. But once you get your word out there, it's the people will find you.
That is very true. And when we're doing stuff with guests too, you want people that, or at least are going to be pleasant to listen to. You don't want somebody who's just going to yell at you or or call you stupid the whole
Some
time
people
that
like
you're
that.
there.
Yeah, and that's not my cup of tea in any way, shape, or form. I don't want to get people on here who are going to yell and scream and try to prove themselves to be the smartest person on earth, because
Yeah.
I've met one of those people in college. It's okay.
Yeah, but I'm sure we've both experienced where you're doing the interview from hell and the person they just talk right over you, and it doesn't matter that you're asking them questions. They just want to hear themselves speak and talk about how wonderful they are. And like, okay, I think I'm going to accidentally hit the delete button on this because they're forgetting that this is my podcast and I know when to air it.
I've been fortunate enough that I haven't had that on this particular show.
Okay.
There are other areas of the fandom where I have very much had that experience. And because that is not my playground, I have to be a good neighbor.
That's a very simple way of putting it, sir.
Yeah. This is my playground, and I'm pretty easygoing on the rules, but there are rules.
Absolutely. And, I always say, if you're going to be the guest on somebody's show, it's kind of like being a guest at somebody's house for dinner, because you really want to act so that you would be invited back.
Mm-hmm.
Because who's going to want to listen to like, oh, he's got that guy on again? Oh no, we'll just wait till next time.
I think to some degree, a little bit comes from like cable TV and the talk shows, the news shows, the things that are incentivized to make people fight each other for entertainment.
Yeah.
There was this mentality that was going to translate over into the internet and podcasting, and it has to some degree. But I also think there's a lot of people like, no, let's be the grown-ups in the room. Let's have something that makes us think for 5 minutes before we turn it off. That's what we're here for.
And exactly. And when it's your show too, you kind of get to call the rules, and you know that what the tone of your show is going to be. You don't want it to turn into a free-for-all, or maybe you do. That's your call.
And I'll pull the curtain back here. This is the first time I've ever actually said this, but what I said to you before I hit the record button is the same thing I say to 99% of the people who sit in that chair right there.
Mm-hmm.
I say, I just want you to have fun. I'm not here to grill you. I'm not here to give you an agenda. Right. I want you to have fun, because if you have fun, so will the audience. And I want the audience to have fun too.
I actually go by the same rule too. I just say, just relax. If you go off on a tangent when you're talking, go off on a tangent. Because sometimes those little tangents actually give the listener a little bit more insight into, the person that's being interviewed.
And so many times that, I've had people on here who have been famous many times over. They've talked about their career for, literally 60 years at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And they've rehearsed that awesome story they have to tell so many times. And I'm glad they're telling it. But it's a practiced bit. They're like Jerry Seinfeld talking about what's the deal with airline peanuts. I need you to break out of that and just talk about why you're having a good day. I need to talk about what's on your mind. Why is this show here a good idea? Why is your next project a good idea? The stuff you're not ready to talk about, let's talk about that.
That's true. Yeah, because we've probably both interviewed Larry Hankin, because as I think as most people in the SJ network have, because he's a good friend with Steve Joyner, our super publicist. And when he goes on everybody's show, it's a different interview every time. He doesn't have that set block of stories to go to. He's got this wide breadth of experience, and because we've all got different shows, we want to focus on different areas of his career. He's like Mr. Podcast to me.
Larry Hankin is one of the gems of the podcasting world for that very reason, because like you just said, he is a different guy each time. He's got a well of information that he can just pull from each time. There's a different bucket each day, but also he's got a sense of humor that is perfect for the internet, because he does best without censorship. Let's put it that way.
and he loves podcasts too. He's a big fan, which makes it even easier. So he, like we were just talking about, you're in that right frame of mind to go into an interview saying, okay, we're just going to go, we're going to talk, we're going to have fun, and and then we're off to the races.
And I've said before, I don't really want to use the word interview on this show because there's so many better ways of just getting a dialogue back and forth.
Mhm.
I find it so easy to sit down with somebody who we don't have the same profession. I mean, you and I do podcasts, so that we have that in common, but I've had video game designers on the show. I can't do that. I'm not a comic book artist. I'm not a film director.
Right.
I'm not a psychic. There's a lot of things I am not. So I want to see what we have in common.
Yeah. Yeah, there's always that that little shred of commonality, I guess, between the guest and the host. And sometimes you don't know it, or sometimes you realize it too late too.
Mhm.
In that last 5 minutes, and it's like, oh, I wish I had known this sooner.
That's a tough one. When you get to the end and you realize you have an hour's worth of stuff that you just thought of, and you have to wrap this up in about 5 minutes.
Those are the ones where like, can you come back?
Mhm, mhm.
It's probably the simplest way of handling that.
And I know maybe somebody listening now might be like, well, I don't have a podcast. Why am I listening to these two clowns? But the thing is, this is what goes into getting the information into your ear these days. And I encourage people to try this because it's very freeing. It's a huge flexibility in the format.
Yeah, there is a new app out. Well, it's not new, actually. It's been out for a little while. I think it just came on Android several months back, called Wisdom. And it's social audio. And you get, it's kind of like Clubhouse, I guess.
Okay.
I don't really know too much about Clubhouse, so I'm not going to speak on that. But Wisdom, like you talk, and you can have people ask you questions, and they get 10 minutes to talk to you. And like, I mean, if they get out of line, you can just say, boop, okay, you're gone. And on Wednesday nights, I do podcasts and podcasting. And I've had people come on who have podcasts, people who've been thinking about doing podcasts, people who just want to maybe compare notes, saying, what are you doing for this? I'm doing this. Do you think it's a good idea? And that really opens it up. The other day, one of my guests was the woman that founded the app, and she had a lot of brilliant things to say about like social audio. And I was saying, it's not one against the other. There's really a lot of intertwining between social audio itself and podcasting. One kind of takes from the other, but it doesn't destroy the other thing either.
That's before I was mentioning the idea that people were taking the fighting for entertainment thing from TV. That's another thing they're taking from TV. They're coming from the idea that if you're watching Leno, you're not watching Letterman. And if you're watching Letterman, you're not watching Leno. And with podcasting, it's like, no, you can find 3 people that you love and just line their stuff up on your phone and listen to all of them. Jim, you and I are not competitors. We're colleagues.
Right. Absolutely. I don't know too many podcasters that have beef with each other anyway.
They do. Oh, I know a lot, but they're wrong for doing that because they're only hurting themselves.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever had a problem with, if there was somebody that I really didn't care for, people are going to listen to who they're going to listen to. Mm-hmm. And it makes me look like a little kid if I'm saying, oh, you shouldn't be listening to, Bob Smith because, his podcast isn't very good. People are going to make up their own minds anyway, what's good and what's not good.
But that woman's app is really interesting. I want to look into it. Have you heard of Good Pods?
Yes, I have. That's like the social media podcast.
It is, and it's got some really great ideas to it. There was a time I took a challenge, and I would, after the episode was wrapped up, without any prep, I would open up the app on mic and just search for something interesting I found in the episode to see how easily I could draw up relevant content through that app. It was like a real-time test, and it worked really well.
That's pretty cool. I didn't really get too heavy into it, but it looked like a good premise. They really like to kind of tie it into social media and recommendations and everything like that, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's kind of an idea of sharing what you're listening with other friends, because that can be an issue, is finding what you're listening to. And if you have friends who are maybe listening to stuff and not sharing it with you, it's hard to keep current.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is true. And I mean, that's probably one thing when when I had you on, like I always say, well, what podcast do you like to listen to? So now it's not, the listener is not only informed about my podcast and not only informed about the Hungry Trilobite, maybe they want to check out what you're listening to if they like, where you're going. They say, well, maybe this guy, is going to lead me in a good direction. So I'll check out some of those podcasts. And I also do Sherpa samples where I go into the podcast charts or I do a theme and I just pick like an episode of each podcast and just to tell people what it's about. I don't really review them. I've always said that, sometimes I'm not the target audience of these podcasts. I've listened to women's podcasts and hip hop podcasts. I'm like, you don't want to hear what I have to say. It's not pretty.
I understand when I'm in this spot, it's like, it doesn't matter what I have to say about this. I'm not the person it's geared toward, and that's okay.
Right.
It really is. But, again, those people are our colleagues. They're doing the same thing for a different audience. And there's usually something we can share about the business.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's always like a little bit of a learning factor between podcasters. We kind of have this like, I don't know, what did you call it? Like a code. It's not like everything that you do. It's not guarded. It's like, oh, you want some information here? I'll give you some information. It's an open sharing platform.
Yeah, it's an open forum, and that it should be, because how often do you get into like support groups and social media clicks for, and I use the word click deliberately, for podcasting?
I will, check out some of the things on social media and see what they're saying. Sometimes, like one thing that I'm really guilty of is if I'm not editing or doing something on a show, I'm looking at things and people, I'm comparing stuff like what's a good video program to use, or a good captioning program, or a good design program. And lots of times in those groups, you'll say, you'll see like those same exact questions, and they'll say, oh, you got to try Headliner or Adobe Audition or whatever it might be, or they might talk about a certain type of microphone, like stay away from this, use this, or there's always definitely a learning thing. I'll tell you a funny story. I started my podcast before COVID hit, so I was using the my phone, and there was an app on the phone that I did the interviews through. And my second guest said, have you ever heard of Zoom? Now, this is like 2019. So I'm like, no, what is that? When COVID hit and everybody's talking about Zoom, I was like, I'm an old pro at this point.
Yeah. And what I was going for is, there's a lot of people, like, those questions drive me crazy, honestly, because you'll have somebody say, well, what's a good mic? And then you have 2 or 3 people say, if you don't use this particular mic, you're wasting your time. And that is such a toxic attitude.
Yeah.
They're gatekeeping, and they're taking something that, what I tell people, there's no wrong choice as long as you know why you're doing what you're doing. You
Right.
can use the different, whatever mic you need, whatever service you need, format you need. It's all yours. Just make a logical choice. And people are like, no, you have to do it my way. And it's weird that people get to that point.
Yeah. And I guess people forget that there are different levels of knowledge when you're doing this thing too. I mean, do you mix your own audio and everything, right?
Mixing is a loose word. Yes.
Okay, that's fair enough. But there are some people that really know this stuff, and they can get into Pro Tools and the stuff that like professional sound engineers use, and looking at that thing, that'll blow your mind. And it might be an excellent program, but for somebody like like me that doesn't have that extensive kind of knowledge, I'm just going to look at it and go, okay, this is going to take me a year to figure out, and nothing is going to sound right. Let's go a little easier and kind of build up from there.
I worked into the show that I'm working with the material I have, which this is going to be a great sounding episode, I'm sure, because I have perfect control over this environment. I'm using my best microphone. I have all my filters on. So I don't have to do a whole lot with this, but there have been episodes I've recorded outdoors, at convention centers, and over terrible connections through Skype. I mean, I've done a lot of the stuff that did not sound good because what was going into it wasn't good, but I really try just to clean up what I have and use it. So my editing skills go into saving disasters.
I can perfectly relate to that, Aaron. A while back, I don't know if you ever interviewed him, Bill Foster, the actor.
So. No, I haven't seen him.
He is incredible. He was on Fear the Walking Dead. He did The Son with Pierce Brosnan. He's written some books, and he's actually directing movies based on his books. He's big on Westerns and stuff like that. Nicest guy you ever want to talk to. I talked to him down on his ranch, and his internet was terrible. So there was some gems that I could understand, but on the recording it was so like, oh, I gotta cut this out. It's killing me. But I had to apologize before, in my intro of the show, and I said, well, I said he's a great guy, but he's got lousy internet on his ranch.
And it does happen. There were some episodes where at a few episodes, I'm not going to say which ones, I could barely understand what the guest was saying. I had to basically just truck along and hope I was getting everything right. And I plug it in, I download that audio, and on the Zoom end, it sounds perfect. And I'm just like, thank you to whatever tech mojo Zoom is using that manages to capture all that stuff on the back end. Because if we had to go by what I heard here, it would be garbage.
I had an interview with somebody, and it was my mic. And when I played it back, the guest's end of the conversation was perfect. I did it on 2 different tracks, so it wasn't mixing into each other. But mine was. So what I did was I took my track. I listened to what I was probably asking him, and I re-recorded my question. So I was basically having a conversation with myself. And I won't say which episode it was. I don't know if people can figure it out, but it was like, hey, I actually got away with it.
Most of the editing I do, like I said, it goes into just covering up stuff like that. And like I said, if it's baked into the concept of the show, this is a free-flowing conversation. The only thing is, I'm thinking the audience doesn't necessarily need to hear if Zoom had a hiccup and I couldn't tell what you were saying, or if I had to go let my dog out, or those are things we can safely just snip right away.
I had somebody email me, and they wanted to come on the show, and I listened to their show, and I think it was an anime podcast or something. It was something along those lines. He was like a younger kid, and I hear him talking, and there was something that he wasn't sure of. And during this conversation, he said, and of course, it's the dead silence, and all I hear is for about 45 seconds. And it was like, okay, nobody needed to know that you were Googling this information. I was dying. I was like, okay, you need to learn how to edit here, my friend, because nobody wants to tune in on their phone and hear somebody typing.
So what? You're an anime fan?
Oh no, well, his show is about anime, so he just wanted to come on it. I don't really know that much about it.
I was curious about how you crossed paths with him, because I'm not much of an anime guy myself, but I know a lot of people in the circle. And I love how jazzed they are about how every single different series there is, and the crazy levels of detail they have in their arguments. It's not my brand of whiskey per se, but I like the vibe.
That is so funny that you bring that up. When I was recording this last batch of Sherpa samples, I always end up with a Dungeons and Dragons podcast and a sports podcast. And that's not something that you want to talk with me about, because, and I'm just like, okay, if you're a fan, you might want to check it out. And just kind of leave it at that. Say what I heard was, a bunch of people who were probably like improv actors or comedians kind of jumping on top of each other with jokes. And, 90% of the reference was to the game itself that I don't understand. And like the sports thing, it's almost like on a technical level sometimes. And they talk about players that I don't know, because I don't really sit and watch sports every weekend. So you kind of take people's word for it that, yeah, they know what they're talking about. All right. Whatever you say.
Well, again, you're kind of getting to the same mentalities, that the granularity of the details. And sometimes sports fans just getting into the idea of my team is best and yours sucks, purely because I've been with it my whole life and for no other reason. There's a lot of that going on there. And I say that as a sports fan. So I'm not throwing anybody under the bus that I'm not joining with them.
They've been indoctrinated.
Yes. How about horror fans?
Horror fans are actually pretty cool.
Horror fans are the stuff, and I'm not a horror fan, but I love hanging out with them.
Yeah. And when the guys that I've talked to about who have horror podcasts, there is such a love for the genre. And, they actually may or may not know some of the people personally that they've interviewed, but they pick up, there's so much like, they idolize these people, and they kind of see themselves in, I think, their guests sometimes, because they tend to say like, oh, some horror people are like outsiders, but as a community, like the horror all just brings them all together, in like a whole different thing, that there's that common bond that they get to share.
Oh, it totally does.
Yeah.
And
I guess it's like musicians playing together, right? If everyone brings a guitar, there's going to be that one song that everybody wants to play.
I think part of it comes down to how much of, there are, I'm sure, some excellent A tier horror movies out there, the best of the best, the gold standards, but they get so jazzed about everything, even the stuff that's horrible by their own standards. They're like, oh, we got to get together and watch this. Okay, I'm going to bring some beers, and we're like, no, they don't. And that's the thing. Like, I'm an Trekkie and a Star Wars fan, and fans of those two things will be like, oh, don't even bother watching, just skip right past it. And horror fans will not say that. They're like, hey, I'm down.
Yeah.
This is absolute shit. Let's get together Thursday night.
That was the worst movie I ever saw. Let's watch it again.
Yes. This time with commentary, so they can tell us how it's shit.
Yeah, it's definitely that, just like a really interesting bond in that community. And it's very welcoming too. It's, they don't care if you've never seen a horror movie and you're willing to, or if you've seen thousands of them, just like, oh, you saw this movie, let's talk about it.
Yeah, and I kind of hope that we can build that with the kind of things you and I are doing here, is like trying to bring people on board with new stuff in a welcoming way. Like, you're introducing so many new people to new shows, and I think that that's a great thing. I'm going to include a link to your show in the show notes on my website.
Thank you.
All your material. Where can people follow your adventures that I might not be aware of?
Yeah, I'm pretty much on any podcast app, all the major ones, and even some of the small ones. I always try and get myself all over. I think, well, if people are listening, then let's get out there. Also, I have a website called sherpalution.com, and they can hear everything from Too Many Podcasts. They can hear all the Sherpa Screening Room interviews. I did a couple of little mini podcasts, one called The Expert Factory, where people came on and just gave advice. And Too Many 80s Songs that I did with my voiceover guy, Lord Bruce Goldberg, who was actually a radio personality in the 80s. So he's a lover of 80s music too. And there's a couple other things too that you can get through the website. I do the affiliate links, and I have my own little Sherpa shop if people want to buy merchandise, all that fun stuff.
Cool. Well, Jim, thank you so much for being here. I've had a great time. You are for sure welcome back anytime you want to come on down.
Thank you so much for having me, Aaron. And you got to come back on my show again too.
Just give me a time and date. I will be there.
You got it.